Some songs hit so hard, so perfectly, that you'd think the artist behind them was destined for decades of fame. But the 1970s had a funny way of proving that wrong. A song would light up every radio in the country, then silence. The artist would vanish as fast as they appeared, leaving behind just that one unforgettable moment in time. Today, we're going back to revisit those moments and the people behind them. These are the one-hit legends who owned the 1970s and then vanished forever. Number 12, Brandy, You're a Fine Girl, by Looking Glass. In the summer of 1972, a song about a barmaid and a sailor sailed straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was called Brandy, You're a Fine Girl, and it came from a New Jersey rock band called Looking Glass. The band had formed at Rutgers University in the late 1960s, made up of Elliot Lurie, Larry Gonski, Jeff Grob, and Peter Swival. They were a tight group of musicians who had been playing together for years before they ever got a record deal. They spent time playing the bar and club circuit up and down the East Coast, building their chops and learning what worked with a live crowd. When they finally signed with Epic Records, nobody, not even the band, quite expected what was about to happen. Brandy told the story of a woman working at a harbor town bar, serving sailors who pass through. The sailors love her, but she's always second to the sea. It was a simple story, but it had an emotional pull that was hard to explain. There was something genuinely moving about it. Elliot Lurie wrote the song, and he wrote it fast. By most accounts, the whole thing came together fairly quickly, almost like it arrived fully formed. The record came out in the spring of 1972, and by August, it was sitting at number 1. It knocked Alone Again, Naturally, by Gilbert O'Sullivan from the top spot, which gives you a sense of just how competitive that particular summer was. The song's reach even extended into Barry Manilow's career. His 1974 hit Mandy was actually a cover of a different song that had originally been titled Brandy, and Manilow had the title changed specifically to avoid confusion with the Looking Glass hit. That's how dominant Brandy was in the cultural memory of the early 1970s. But after Brandy, Looking Glass couldn't replicate the magic. They released follow-up singles and even a second album, but nothing connected the way that first song had. By the mid-1970s, the band had quietly broken up. Elliot Lurie eventually moved into music licensing and production work, which kept him connected to the industry even as his performing days faded. The rest of the band stepped away from the spotlight entirely. Brandy never really went away, though. It showed up in films, TV shows, commercials, and playlists for decades. For a song that was supposed to launch a career, it ended up being something far more lasting than a launch pad. It became the whole story. Number 11, Torn Between Two Lovers by Mary MacGregor. There are songs that made people uncomfortable in the best possible way, and Torn Between Two Lovers was one of them. Released in late 1976, it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1977 and stayed there for 2 weeks. It also topped the adult contemporary chart. For a debut single, that was a remarkable achievement. Mary MacGregor was a Minnesota-born singer who had spent years working her way through the music world, doing backup vocals, doing session work, waiting for a break. She had actually been singing backup on Peter Yarrow's solo tours and appeared on his album before he brought the song to her. When Yarrow wrote Torn Between Two Lovers with Philip Jarrell and brought it to her, everything changed almost overnight. The song tackled something that pop radio didn't usually touch so directly: a woman emotionally and romantically caught between two men, making no apologies for it. It was frank without being scandalous, honest without being harsh. Audiences responded to that honesty in enormous numbers. MacGregor toured, appeared on television programs, and worked to build on the success. She performed on programs like American Bandstand and The Midnight Special, which were the stages every hit act passed through in that era. But the follow-up singles didn't find the same audience. Her second album came and went. By the early 1980s, her recording career had largely come to an end, and she stepped away from the music industry. She has given occasional interviews over the years, and there's never been any bitterness in what she says about her career. She had one extraordinary moment, and she knew it while it was happening. That's more than most people ever get. Number 10. Afternoon Delight by Starland Vocal Band. In 1976, a quartet from Washington, D.C. released a song that became inescapable. Afternoon Delight by the Starland Vocal Band hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in July of that year and won the Grammy Award for Best New Artist in 1977. It also won the Grammy for Best Arrangement for Voices. 2 Grammys for a debut single. That almost never happens. The group was made up of Bill Danoff, Taffy Nivert, John Carroll, and Margot Chapman. Bill Danoff had already made a mark in the music world. He co-wrote Take Me Home, Country Roads with John Denver and Taffy Nivert. So this wasn't a group of total unknowns. But Starland Vocal Band was their own project, their own sound, and Afternoon Delight was the centerpiece of it. The song was reportedly inspired by a happy hour menu at Clyde's restaurant in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., one of those wonderfully mundane origin stories that becomes charming in hindsight. The song was bright, breezy, and built around gorgeous 4-part harmonies. It had a warmth to it that made it feel like a summer afternoon even in the middle of winter. CBS gave the group their own television variety show in 1977. That should have been the next step in a long career, but the show was canceled after just one summer run, and subsequent albums failed to produce another hit of anywhere near the same magnitude. By the end of the decade, the group had essentially run its course. The Grammy win for Best New Artist later became something of a footnote in Grammy history. Their year is sometimes cited as one of the more surprising wins, but the song itself has never stopped being heard. It's been featured in television shows and films many times over, often introduced to entirely new generations. The harmonies hold up completely. Number 9. Shannon by Henry Gross. If you were listening to the radio in 1976, you heard Shannon. It was everywhere that spring and summer. A gentle, heartfelt song that climbed to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent weeks on the adult contemporary chart. Henry Gross was a Brooklyn-born musician who had actually been part of the original lineup of Sha Na Na, the rock and roll revival group that performed at Woodstock in 1969. He had gone solo after that, working his way through several albums with moderate success. Then came Shannon. The song was written about a dog, specifically Carl Wilson's dog, also named Shannon, who had recently been killed by a car. Gross was friends with Wilson after touring with the Beach Boys in 1975. And the two had a memorable conversation when Gross mentioned that he himself had an Irish setter named Shannon. Wilson told him his own dog, a Samoyed, had just died with the same name. That coincidence clearly struck Gross deeply. He turned that shared grief into music. Though listeners didn't necessarily know the song's origin at the time, many assumed it was about a person, and the emotional weight of it worked either way. Shannon was a perfect example of a song that transcended its subject. Whatever its origins, it touched something real in the people who heard it. Gross recorded follow-ups and continued performing and releasing music, but nothing reached the level of that one song. He remained active as a musician and performer for years, playing shows and connecting with fans, but the mainstream spotlight never returned in the same way. Number 8. Wildfire by Michael Martin Murphey. The winter of 1975 brought one of the most haunting songs to ever reach the top 5 of the Billboard Hot 100. Wildfire by Michael Martin Murphey peaked at number 3 in the spring of that year and became an instant classic of the soft rock era. Murphy was a Texas-born singer-songwriter who had been making music and writing songs for others for years before his own moment arrived. He had recorded for several labels and built a following in the folk and country-influenced rock scene. But Wildfire was something different. It was a narrative song, the story of a girl and her horse in a blizzard, told in almost mythological terms. The production was sweeping, cinematic, emotional. It sounded like nothing else on the radio at the time. The song came out of a dream Murphy had, and the imagery, the pony, the snow, the vanishing girl, stuck with listeners the same way a vivid dream sticks with you in the morning. It had mystery built into it. You weren't entirely sure what had happened in the story, and that ambiguity was part of the power. The song was also produced with a sweeping orchestral arrangement that was somewhat unusual for a country-leaning singer-songwriter at the time. And that production choice is a big part of why it crossed over to such a wide pop audience. It reached number 3 nationally and became one of the defining sounds of 1975, but the pop crossover success didn't repeat itself. Murphy continued making music, a great deal of music in fact, but he moved further into country and western territory as the years went on. He had hits in the country world, including What's Forever 4 in 1982, which means he wasn't truly a one-hit wonder in the broadest sense. But in terms of a mainstream pop impact, Wildfire stood completely alone. That song still gets requests at classic radio stations. People who were teenagers in 1975 still know every word. Number 7. Chevy Van by Sammy Johns. There is an entire micro-genre of 1970s songs about life on the open road, and Chevy Van by Sammy Johns sits near the top of that list. Released in 1975, the song peaked at number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of the quintessential soft rock singles of the mid-decade. Sammy Johns was a North Carolina-born musician who had been performing since the early 1970s and had put in considerable work as a songwriter and session performer before Chevy Van connected. The song had actually been recorded a couple of years before it charted. It had been floating around in different versions before the right recording found its way to radio. It was a road song, a freedom song, a story about a brief encounter in the open highway. It fit perfectly into the mood of mid-1970s America, where the romance of road trips, wide-open spaces, and simple pleasures resonated with a wide audience. The 1970s had a whole culture built around the van. Customized vans were everywhere. Van clubs existed in cities and suburbs alike, and the vehicle had become a symbol of a particular kind of freewheeling American life. Chevy Van landed right in the middle of all of that. Johns followed up with more recordings and continued to work in music, but Chevy Van remained the peak. He performed it for decades, and audiences who remembered 1975 always responded warmly to it. There's a specific kind of nostalgia attached to that song. It puts you right back on a summer highway. Number 6. Undercover Angel by Alan O'Day. The summer of 1977 belonged to a lot of big songs, but one of the most unexpected number ones was Undercover Angel by Alan O'Day. It hit the top of the Billboard Hot 100 in June 1977 and stayed there for 1 week. O'Day was actually already well established as a songwriter behind the scenes. He had written Angie Baby for Helen Reddy in 1974, which went to number 1. He had also written songs for other artists through the early 1970s. So he understood the mechanics of a hit record from the inside out. He knew the music industry from the inside, but performing was a different thing. And when he stepped in front of the microphone himself with Undercover Angel, it worked in ways even he might not have anticipated. The song had a playful, almost otherworldly quality. It was a fantasy story told with a light touch and a warm, melodic delivery. Radio picked it up immediately. It was bright without being throwaway, fun without being flimsy. But as a performer, O'Day didn't sustain chart success after that summer. He continued writing for others and remained a presence in the industry in that capacity. But the recording career never matched that one peak. When you've already written a number 1 for someone else and then had your own number 1, that's a career most musicians would envy regardless of what came after. Number 5. Precious and Few by Climax.
If I can't find my way
Before Precious and Few, most people had never heard of Climax. After it, they still might not have known much about the band, but they knew that song. Released in late 1971 and hitting the top of the charts in early 1972, Precious and Few peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent 3 weeks at number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. It was a soft, intimate ballad, hushed and delicate in a way that made it feel almost private, like you were overhearing something personal. Climax was a Los Angeles-based group, and their lead singer, Sonny Garachi, had actually had some prior success with a group called The Outsiders in the late 1960s. They were a Cleveland band who had a hit called Time Won't Let Me in 1966. So this wasn't Garachi's first moment in the spotlight, but Precious and Few was Climax's moment, and it was singular. The group tried to follow it up, but nothing clicked in the same way. The softer end of the pop market was crowded in the early 1970s, and finding a second song with that kind of emotional simplicity and impact was genuinely difficult. There was also a broader shift happening in pop music as the decade progressed. Harder rock, funk, and the early rumblings of disco were all pulling listener attention in different directions. And the quiet balladry that Precious and Few represented was becoming harder to sustain commercially. By the mid-1970s, Climax had faded from the charts entirely. Precious and Few shows up on soft rock and easy listening compilations consistently even now. People who were young couples in 1972 have a particular relationship with that song. It was used at weddings, it was played on dates. It was the background music of a specific kind of romantic memory. Number 4, Hitchin' a Ride by Vanity Fair. Not to be confused with the Green Day song of the same name from the 1990s, Hitchin' a Ride by the British group Vanity Fair was a top 10 hit in the United States in 1970, reaching number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Vanity Fair was a pop group from Rochester, Kent, England, who had been performing since the mid-1960s. They had some success in the UK before Hitchin' a Ride crossed the Atlantic and found a large American audience. The song was upbeat, catchy, almost impossibly cheerful. The kind of track that made the radio feel warmer just by coming on. It had a rolling, locomotive energy to it that felt immediately familiar. The sort of song that sounded like you'd known it your whole life, even the first time you heard it. In the United Kingdom, they'd had a prior hit with Early in the Morning in 1969, so they weren't unknown at home. But in America, Hitchin' a Ride was their arrival and their exit at the same time. The group continued performing in the UK through the 1970s and beyond, with various lineup changes over the years. But the American chart success never returned. And in the broader pop history of the era, they remain defined by that one bright, breezy moment in 1970. For American listeners of a certain age, hearing that opening just transports them right back to the start of the decade. Number 3, Wildflower by Skylark. Some songs have a way of sounding timeless from the moment they're released. And Wildflower by Skylark was exactly that. Released in 1973, it peaked at number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became a staple of soft rock radio that has never really gone away. Skylark was a Canadian group based in Vancouver, and their connection to pop music history runs a little deeper than most people realize. The group included David Foster, who would go on to become one of the most successful record producers and songwriters in the industry, producing records for artists like Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, Michael Bublé, and dozens of others over a career spanning decades. Foster has spoken about this period of his life in interviews, often with warmth and some humor. He was young, the band was scraping by, and nobody had any idea what was coming next. Careful how you touch her, for she'll awaken. At the time Wildflower came out, Foster was just a young musician in a band trying to make it. The song was written by Doug Edwards and Dave Richardson, and it was built around a beautiful, soulful melody and a lyric about a woman's quiet resilience. Eric Wangberg produced the record with a warmth that suited the song perfectly. Skylark didn't survive long after Wildflower. The band broke up in 1974 and the members went on to other things, Foster's path being the most dramatic of all. But Wildflower remained. It's been covered many times. It became a standard in easy listening and soft rock, the kind of song that other musicians reach for when they want to say something genuinely tender. Knowing what David Foster became makes the song feel even more interesting in retrospect. This is where part of that story quietly began. Number 2, Patches by Clarence Carter. Clarence Carter is not completely forgotten. He maintained a career in soul and R&B for many years, but Patches was the moment that put him in front of the widest possible American audience. Released in 1970, it reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hit number 2 on the R&B chart. Carter was an Alabama-born musician who had been blind since childhood, and he had been recording for Atlantic Records through the late 1960s with some genuine success in the R&B world. Patches was different in scope. It was a song that crossed over significantly into the mainstream pop audience. The song told the story of a boy from a poor family in the Deep South, stepping up to support his family after the death of his father. It was a story song, deeply Southern in its roots, emotional in its delivery, and Carter sang it with complete conviction. The name Patches came from the nickname of the community in the song. Patches was the poorest section of town. The production was sophisticated, full strings, a dramatic build, but Carter's voice was the center of everything. It was a performance that didn't need embellishment. Patches was written by General Norman Johnson and Ronald Dunbar, who had crafted a song that worked as both personal testimony and universal story. The kind of writing that doesn't come along often. Carter delivered it as though every word was his own, which is the highest compliment you can give a vocalist interpreting someone else's material. He continued recording and performing well into the following decades, which technically removes him from the pure one-hit wonder category. But in terms of the mainstream pop chart peak that Patches represented, it was a moment that stood apart from everything else in his career. Number 1, The Night Chicago Died by Paper Lace. Paper Lace was a British band from Nottingham who had an extraordinary run in 1974. The Night Chicago Died hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August of that year, making it their biggest American success. Earlier that same year, another Paper Lace single, Billy Don't Be a Hero, had also charted. Though, interestingly, the American hit version of Billy Don't Be a Hero is most often associated with Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods, who covered it and had the bigger US hit. Paper Lace's version did well in the UK. The Night Chicago Died was a dramatic pop song set against the backdrop of 1920s gangster-era Chicago. It told a fictional story of a young man whose policeman father faces off against Al Capone's gang. There's no historical accuracy to the events in the song. It's pure pop mythology, but it was told with such energy and style that it didn't matter. It was irresistible. The band had a theatrical, storytelling approach to songwriting that worked beautifully in the pop context of 1974. The group had been together since the late 1960s. They'd even won a talent competition called Opportunity Knocks in the UK, which was the equivalent of winning a primetime talent show. They had the performance experience and the stage presence, but they couldn't maintain American chart presence after that summer. They continued performing in the UK where they retained a following, but the US spotlight didn't return. The Night Chicago Died is one of those songs that people remember more than they remember who sang it. If you were alive in 1974, you know the song. Paper Lace, on the other hand, takes a moment longer to place. Every one of these artists had their moment. Some of them had months, some had just one summer, some had a single week at number 1. But the songs they left behind have outlasted careers that went on for decades. That's the strange math of the 1970s music scene. It wasn't always about who stayed longest. Sometimes it was about who hit hardest just once. And maybe that's what makes these songs feel the way they do. There's no catalog to distract from them, no later work that complicates the memory. Just that one perfect recording, frozen exactly as it was. The same as the first time you heard it coming out of a car radio or a kitchen speaker on some ordinary afternoon that turned out not to be ordinary at all. If any of these songs brought back a memory today, drop it in the comments. We'd love to know which one got you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. We do this every week, going back to the music that shaped the generations that came before the algorithms. Hit like if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in the next one.